do you have that one postcard of Laura, Mary, and Carrie on your desk somewhere? Have you framed it? And I said, no. And she said, well, you should, because when Mrs. Lichty handed you back that photograph, she was giving you your future.
Welcome to Land of Laura, the irreverent yet scholarly podcast about all things Laura Ingalls Wilder. Pamela Smith Hill was a longtime college instructor and fiction writer from Portland, Oregon, when she was tapped to write 2007's Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life. A few years later, she edited and annotated Pioneer Girl, Wilder's memoir that provided the framework for the Little House series. Published in 2014, Pioneer Girl shocked everyone by landing on national bestseller lists, with its initial 15,000-copy print run selling out in just 3 weeks. 200,000 copies later, the book has gone through 17 printings. In July 2025, Pamela released her third book on Laura Ingalls Wilder, published by University of Nebraska Press, Too Good to Be Altogether Lost. I recently sat down with her for the first of what I hope will be several conversations for Land of Laura. In this one, her origin story. I hope you enjoy it. It is a special day here at Land of Laura. Pamela Smith Hill is in the studio.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. Any guests that we have on the podcast, we ask them their Little House origin story. And usually that's just the first part of the episode. But I have a feeling that yours might extend to the entire episode, because Laura Ingalls Wilder seems to be a consistent thread sewn into the fabric of your life. Could you tell us how you started with Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Well, I think it actually starts with where I was born. I was born in Springfield, Missouri, which is in the middle of the Missouri Ozarks. And this is important because, of course, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote all of her books from Rocky Ridge Farm in the Missouri Ozarks. So I was born in her part of the country. And I think from there, my Laura Ingalls Wilder origin story relates to my life as an early reader. I became a passionate reader in first grade after I read my first book, which was a Ted and Sally early reader called Splash. And I was so excited that I could read the words. Now, perhaps I had memorized the book, but in my own mind, I had read it. And from that point on, reading opened up all kinds of worlds for me. And I became a bookworm, a committed bookworm that everyone in my family kind of worried about because I spent so much time with my nose in books. My family moved out of town in Springfield to an acreage in the country at the end of second grade. And in third grade, I started a new school. And for some reason, I was put into a class of slow learners. And my teacher, Mrs. Crichton, realized that I was finishing my assignments before anybody else. And so she would direct me to the bookshelves where I could pick out a book and read while everybody else was finishing their assignment. When we kind of ran out of books in the classroom, she would send me up to the library, located behind the stage, and you had to walk up some stairs, and the library was a circular room. It was very small and intimate, this really magical place. And of course, there was always a librarian there. And she recognized the bookworm in me and started recommending books for me regularly, and we became really fast friends. Well, after 3 or 4 weeks went by, Mrs. Crichton recommended that I was moved to a different classroom. So I didn't have as much time for that free reading, but I had learned that I could check out all kinds of books from the library and take them home. And so I read all the Betsy Tacy books. I read many of those fictional biographies that were kind of standard reading material for kids of my generation. And I really loved stories about the past. And that could be because I was a PK, a preacher's kid. So I grew up on Bible stories. My dad loved old Westerns. My mom loved old musicals. So I was really fluent in the past anyway. And then it must have been the summer between third and fourth grade. My reputation as a bookworm had spread. And a neighbor told my mom about a series of books by a Missouri author, and she thought I would enjoy them. And of course, the name of the writer was Laura Ingalls Wilder. looking back on it, I'm surprised that Mom didn't know who Laura Ingalls Wilder was, because my mom would have been in that first generation of Little House readers, but she hadn't read them as a child.
Was she aware of how close you were geographically?
No. Mom had never heard of Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm surprised that the librarian in my school library hadn't recommended Wilder to me at that point. So it was in the summertime. We lived out in the country, as I said before, and Mom would drive us into the spot where the bookmobile parked by the country club. And so I decided to look for a Wilder book. The juvenile books were in the back of the bus of the bookmobile, and there's only one Wilder title, and it was Little Town on the Prairie. And that's the one that introduced me to Wilder's world. And I immediately made the connection between Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the books, and Laura Ingalls, who was in the books. And that's what really attracted me, because in third grade, I had decided I wanted to be a writer. And I started writing little picture books, and the pictures were better than the stories. But Mom kept them and encouraged me to write. And that was really what intrigued me. I love the stories. I love the stories about the past and the family of girls. But I really was interested in Laura Ingalls Wilder as a writer, because when I was in third and fourth grade, my picture of a writer was a very sophisticated New York woman, or maybe she lived in California or in Great Britain. You know, there were English or New Yorkers or Californians, and they wore beautiful designer clothes, and they drank champagne cocktails like they'd seen in the old movies. And they smoked cigarettes on those long cigarette holders. They were very sophisticated. And then Laura Ingalls Wilder, I learned, lived 40 miles from my house. And she had been a farm woman. And she started writing later in life. And I thought, wow, maybe someone from the Missouri Ozarks can actually write a book. And so that's what really intrigued me about Wilder in the beginning. And so I read all the books. I couldn't read them in sequence because I had to go to the library to find them. Although my father was a minister and he had a study filled with books, most of the books were different versions of the New Testament or the Bible, or concordances or collections of sermons. The only books we had in the house for reading was, we had Mom's old copy of Little Women. I think we had a copy of Heidi. We had all kinds of golden books, but we didn't have, books. So I don't remember what order I read them in, but over the next year, I read them all. And then on May 29th, I am now consulting my very first diary.
Oh my goodness. For listeners, it is a red-covered diary with a lock that maybe doesn't work anymore.
It's broken. And as you can see, I wrote, this was a 5-year diary, and so I wrote within the lines at that point.
Similar to one of Rose Wilder Lane's diaries.
Yeah. But this was my first diary, and I abandoned it after only a few months. But on May 29th, 1965, I went to the Wilder home. It was my first visit. And my parents had planned a trip up to northeastern Missouri to visit friends who had retired to a family farm in Owensville. And obviously, they knew that I loved Wilder. And so on the way up, this was on a Memorial Day weekend, we went up to the Wilder house. And although I just wrote that one line about her, that visit really stuck with me for a variety of reasons.
What was that like back then?
Well, there wasn't really a museum then. It was just the house. There was no museum. As I said, it was Memorial Day weekend, but my parents, my sister and I were the only visitors at the house. We had a private tour. My memory, and I'm not sure if this is accurate, but this is how I remember it. When we walked in the kitchen, there were these old-fashioned glass bookcases, and in it were a couple of Wilder's manuscripts. And as a kid, I was so impressed because the young writer in me was encouraged, because not only was Laura Ingalls Wilder from my part of the world, but she wrote her books on big chief tablets, exactly like I used in school. And our tour guide, who I suspect was probably Mrs. Lichty, she and her husband were the caretakers during that period.
Irene Lichty.
Irene Lichty, told me that she wrote with number 2 lead pencils, also what I used in school. So it was like, wow, I could write a book on a Big Chief tablet with number 2 pencils. I mean, the 11-year-old in me was just really impressed and inspired. And on the way out, Mom and Dad let me buy a couple of pictures. There really wasn't a gift shop. They had a rack of postcards and old pictures. I think you could buy some books, but I didn't have, my allowance wasn't big enough to allow me to buy a book. So I bought 2 pictures. I bought a picture, a little black and white snapshot, postcard size picture of Laura Ingalls Wilder in a beautiful white linen dress, standing by a creek at Rocky Ridge. And I thought, oh, she looks so elegant. And then I bought that picture that we all know of the 3 Ingalls girls, of Carrie, Mary, and Laura. Laura and Mary are in their gingham dresses, Mary sitting down. And Mrs. Lichty apparently thought that I would not remember which girl was which. So you can see this here. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you can see, but in ballpoint pen, she wrote under the image of each girl, Carrie, Mary, and Laura.
Just in case you couldn't keep them straight.
In case I couldn't keep them straight. And years later, I think I was in Idaho giving a presentation on Pioneer Girl. And I told this story to the audience. And afterwards, one of the members of the audience came up to me and said, I know you still have those postcards, but do you have that one postcard of Laura, Mary, and Carrie on your desk somewhere? Have you framed it? And I said, no. And she said, well, you should, because when Mrs. Lichty handed you back that photograph, she was giving you your future. So I immediately came home, dug the picture out of an old file, and it's framed on my desk now.
She was right.
Yeah, she was right. As I grew older, I continued to cherish the Little House books. When I was in high school, the first 4 years was published, and I looked forward to reading it. But like so many others, I was really disappointed with it. It didn't seem to fit. It didn't seem like the same Laura Ingalls from the books. It was very unsatisfying. I was disappointed with it. I also read on the way home when it came out. But by this time, I was in high school, getting ready to go off to college, and I was reading Edna Ferber's novels and Daphne du Maurier's novels and Jane Austen, and I was studying Chaucer and Shakespeare. So I kind of left Laura Ingalls Wilder behind, although she was still part of my past. And also during those years, I used her example because I was writing. I wrote for my junior high newspaper. I was the news editor of my high school paper, and I went on to be the editor of my college paper. And while I was editing my college paper, I got a call from my hometown newspaper, Springfield Newspapers, and I was asked to become a staff writer and work on their old-fashioned society page. In those days, when you started out as a cub reporter, you started out either in obituaries or in society. And society was kind of the foundation for what we now know as the living sections of newspapers. And it was really better for me to start in society because I got bylines earlier. I got to write feature stories. And I started going out on assignment with one of the newspaper's most prominent photographers. She was getting toward the end of her career. Her name was Betty Love. And so we went out on assignment together often, and her pictures often accompanied my stories. I'll get back to Betty in a minute because she's important, but I didn't know it at the time. And then I made an unfortunate marriage, and I had to give up my job, and I moved to South Dakota. And the plan was for me to put my husband through grad school and to suspend my own studies until he had finished. To make a long story short, I was very lucky, and I got a job in the English department, and they allowed me to continue my studies. Moving to South Dakota from the Missouri Ozarks was really, really difficult. It's a totally different landscape up there, and I was incredibly unhappy. I felt that the prairie was too big. I felt exposed. I wanted hills and trees and that soft blue Ozark sky. And instead, it was just the biggest sky I'd ever seen. And I remember on my first trip to South Dakota when we were looking for an apartment, I sat on the curb in front of one of the old University of South Dakota buildings and just wept. I thought, I can't live here. But then I remembered the Wilder books, and I reread them all. And the Wilder books helped me make peace with the South Dakota prairie. It was kind of my, Wilder's books were my therapy. They helped me understand the world I was living in. But more importantly, perhaps, when I reread the books as a more intelligent, perhaps more discriminating reader, I came to realize that not only was Wilder a gifted children's book writer, she was just a gifted writer. She wrote about the prairie in a way that was so immediate, so real, and so authentic. And I felt like living on the South Dakota prairie as I was, that I could really appreciate her artistry even more because I was living in the setting where 5 of her books take place.
So where exactly was this in South Dakota?
This is in Vermilion.
This was in Vermilion. Okay.
South Dakota is in Vermilion.
Okay.
So it's in the southeastern part of the state. But of course, where Wilder set her books is also in the eastern part of the state.
Right.
And it was about a couple of hours north and a little bit west of where Vermilion is located. But it's essentially the same landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that I grew to appreciate is, as I said, the authenticity and artistry of her books. When I read The Long Winter as a kid, growing up in the Ozarks, I didn't believe her descriptions of the blizzards. I thought that she had exaggerated them to tell a better story because I was from a family of storytellers who would exaggerate stories about tornadoes and copperhead snakes and the big catfish that got away. So I thought The Long Winter was hyperbole. And then I experienced my first South Dakota blizzard, and I realized, oh no, she was absolutely telling the truth.
An actual blizzard where you couldn't see in front of you?
In front of me. And later on, I actually was stranded in a blizzard, and I wasn't sure that we would get out. I was stranded on the Crow Creek Indian Reservation in a blizzard where you could not see the hand in front of your face in a car that had broken down. And I wasn't sure we were going to get out. And actually, the Highway Patrol came through on snowmobiles and took us up the road to a stranded RV, and everything turned out fine. But anyway, it gave me a new appreciation for her. And then eventually, when I was in South Dakota, I went to work for the South Dakota Division of Tourism as a publicity writer. I wrote press releases and commercials and brochures. And because at this point I had graduated with degrees in English literature with a minor in history, my beat, what I tended to write about for tourism, was all things literary, all things historical. And so obviously Laura Ingalls Wilder fell into that general assignment. And in fact, I think my very first feature article was something called Walk with Frontier Legends, and it included a big section on Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Did that job allow you the opportunity to go to De Smet?
Yes. When I was working for tourism, one of my assignments was to go to De Smet and cover their centennial. And their centennial took place in 1980. And when I went up there, I got to meet with Aubrey Sherwood.
Oh my goodness.
And Aubrey Sherwood was the retired editor of the De Smet newspaper, but he had known the Ingalls family. He had corresponded, of course, with Laura Ingalls Wilder after she became Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author. And she and Hal Manzo had come up and visited with him. And Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote Aubrey Sherwood back and forth. She explained how that she had exaggerated a few things in By the Shores of Silver Lake, which is the first book that takes place in De Smet. So they knew each other really well. And it was a pleasure to actually talk to him and share his memories of the Ingalls family. I also got to meet Vivian Glover, who was another old-timer in De Smet, who had some experiences and some memories of the Ingalls family. And I've kept all those notes all those years. I kept them with me. But the other really wonderful thing about beginning to write about Laura Ingalls Wilder was doing the research. And I want to go back to Betty Love. When I was working on feature stories and articles about Laura Ingalls Wilder for South Dakota Tourism, it dawned on me that my old newspaper probably had old clippings featuring Laura Ingalls Wilder and perhaps Rose Wilder Lane, and one of my good friends was still working at the newspaper. So I asked her to go through the morgue. That's what we called all the old newspaper files back in those days, to go through the morgue and pull out any clippings that she could find about Laura Ingalls Wilder. And she sent me a whole folder full. And as I was going through, I realized that there were photo credits to Betty Love, that the photographer that I had worked on assignment with had photographed Laura Ingalls Wilder and Almanzo many, many times. And she probably took the last photograph of Almanzo Wilder in 1949, just a few months before his death. And it's one of the pictures that appears in Too Good to Be Altogether Lost. But by the time I made that discovery, Betty was already gone. And I couldn't really talk to her about her memories of Laura Ingalls Wilder, but she photographed them at Rocky Ridge Farm. So I feel like, my past life in the Ozarks was really instrumental in forming my passion for Laura Ingalls Wilder and her work. After I left tourism, I was able to do some freelance writing and sold a couple of travel stories about Wilder to other magazines like Country Living, for example.
So how did you end up leaving South Dakota?
I lived in South Dakota from 1974 until about 1982. My first marriage broke up there. My second very happy marriage began there, and my daughter was born there. One of the first things I did after my daughter was born was make sure we had copies of the Little House books in the house. So I bought the standard box set, which I still have. It's now held together with rubber bands, and there are Post-it notes all over them with underlined passages everywhere. And of course, I read them aloud to my daughter. I started reading aloud to my daughter when she was 2 or 3 months old. And I've read to her every day until she was about 10 or 11 when she said, "Mom, I think I can do this on my own now," which kind of broke my heart. But then the three of us moved from South Dakota briefly to Kansas, from Kansas to Colorado, where we lived for, we moved there in 83 and we left in 1990. And then from 1990 on, I've lived in Oregon. So in some ways, I kind of have traced Laura Ingalls Wilder's path backwards. And then I ended up in Oregon, where, of course, Pa always wanted to settle. Along the way, I did a lot of corporate writing, but still nursed my passion to write fiction. And I began writing fiction seriously in Colorado while I was doing corporate jobs. I also started teaching on college campuses there. I taught professional and technical writing and advertising, both at the University of Colorado and at Colorado State. Wilder's work was always important to me, and I also began teaching creative writing classes. And my students would always roll their eyes when I suggested that they read Laura Ingalls Wilder, because they were creative writing students, and why should we read children's books? I always encountered resistance initially, and then they would start reading her work, and like I did when I rediscovered her in South Dakota, they realized that she was a really gifted artist, that her style of writing was eloquent, graceful, and deceptively simple. And they grew to embrace her work as well. So it was really gratifying for me to share Wilder's work as a writer and as a teacher with aspiring writers, which was also a gift. And then when we moved to Oregon, I was still doing corporate work, but my fiction writing life was taking over. I left the corporate world behind, began teaching full-time on college campuses. I became the director of the professional and creative writing programs eventually at Washington State University, just across the river from Portland. And I published my first novels in Portland. And my first novel, by the way, Ghost Horses, is set in South Dakota. One reason I set it in South Dakota was because it was based on a freelance article I did about the world's then sixth Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton that was discovered in South Dakota, and that inspired the novel. But I was also influenced by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I have a blizzard scene that's not anything like The Long Winter, but I drew on my memories from South Dakota and was inspired by Laura Ingalls Wilder. So I've been in Oregon since 1990. Oregon is a really great place to write from. There are so many writers in Portland, and I got involved with a critique group here. The critique group has gone through several transformations, but most of us have been reading each other's work and commenting on their work for over 30 years now. It's really been a joy to work with writers like that over such a long period of time. And they helped me with Writer's Life, they helped me with Pioneer Girl, and they helped me with Too Good to Be Altogether Lost. So I owe a lot to my critique group and my fellow authors.
Every writer should be so lucky to have such a group for so long.
Yes, I feel like it's been a real gift.
You wrote 3 young adult novels from a young female perspective. Were you always drawn to YA writing for young girls from a reading perspective and from a writing perspective? Was that really your sweet spot in terms of what you liked to read and what you liked to write?
I think part of me is still a 15 or 16-year-old girl. And I still write from that perspective. I was drawn to writing young adult fiction because I think young adult readers are poised to make big decisions in their lives. When you write for that audience, they kind of lap up the stories and they absorb the characters so well. And a really good young adult novel can stay with you into adulthood. And perhaps because the first Wilder book I read was Little Town on the Prairie, which quite frankly is a young adult novel, maybe that really influenced me to write young adult stories because they are coming of age stories. When young people are trying to figure out who they are, just as Laura tries to figure out who she is in Little Town on the Prairie. So I think that influenced me. And that's one reason why I still like to write for young adults. And young adult readers usually aren't as jaded as adult readers. They still have a more open mind. They're still craving new ideas and new adventures. They're not as closed or as jaded, perhaps, as adult readers are. And I also think because they're more open-minded and because they're still searching and questing, they expect a lot from writers. I think, sometimes writers of young adult fiction are asked, when are you going to grow up and write an adult novel? Well, the adult novels, you can, I think, be a sloppier writer when you write for adults than when you write for young adults. Young adult novels tend to be lean. They're not as lean as they used to be, but every word has to count. Mm-hmm. Because if you start philosophizing too much, you lose that reader right away. So you have to show and not tell what you're trying to express. And that's a huge creative challenge. And I think that appealed to me too. Still does.
I saw you speak recently at the South Dakota Book Festival, and you said something that really stuck with me about how young adult / children's books lately have been teaching moral lessons more than really telling the stories that they used to tell, and that they feel a lot like lectures. And as a parent now who has been reading my entire life and has a huge love for young adult and always will, and probably also will always be 15 inside. I think back to like Judy Blume, and they were some they did not behave very well in those
Right,
books.
right.
And it was up to us as a reader. We weren't told. It was up to us to say that behavior is not okay.
Well, I think that the best young adult books are always slightly subversive. The characters aren't always completely virtuous. They do make mistakes. And in the best YA novels, when the characters make mistakes and get into trouble, they have to get out of those situations on their own. They have to figure out how to resolve their conflicts without an author standing in the shadows explaining how they should make those decisions or why they made those decisions, or if they made the right decisions, how we should all make decisions like that, which is kind of the subtext right now of a lot of the books that are being published. And I think that's unfortunate. And it may surprise some people who assume that Laura Ingalls Wilder's books are very didactic, but they're not.
No.
She lets readers make their own decisions about how the characters act and respond and sort things out. And I think it's really dangerous to start preaching to young adult readers because, I don't know, maybe it was because I was a preacher's daughter and I grew up listening to sermons 3 times a week. But if I picked up a book that would tell me what to think, I would immediately close it and put it away. And I do know that younger people aren't reading as much as they used to. There are all kinds of studies that show this. And a lot of it may be related to social media and the internet and computer use. But I also think it's because the stories that are getting published right now are too didactic and consequently a little bit boring. I mean, the best characters in American young adult fiction are subversive. Judy Blume's characters, for example. Let's go back to Huckleberry Finn. And even Jo Marsh. She didn't always behave the way she should. And of course, Laura Ingalls follows in that tradition too. Mary, by contrast, was always the good sister. Laura was the one who always got into scrapes and never really regretted her bad behavior.
No, she didn't.
Which makes her very likable and approachable.
Do you think you'll ever go back to fiction?
I have to admit that even when I was working on Pioneer Girl, I was writing a young adult novel. And I have continued to write young adult fiction, but because the field has changed, as the young adult fiction has become more didactic and they want different kinds of stories than I write, I haven't been able to find a publisher, but I will probably write fiction until my dying day.
Tell us what led up to your writing Laura Ingalls Wilder, A Writer's Life, which was ultimately published in 2007.
I received a phone call from Nancy Tysted-Copel, who was the editor and the director of the South Dakota State Historical Society Press. I think it was in 2005. And she asked me if I would be interested in writing a biography about Wilder because she thought that since I wrote young adult fiction myself, I might have a different understanding or a different approach to take about Wilder's life and her work. And I agreed right away. The suggestion was that I should, even though I was a novelist myself, to approach Laura Ingalls Wilder as a South Dakota writer. Well, because I was from Missouri and had grown up thinking of her as a Missouri writer, that didn't exactly make sense to me. And I also thought, quite frankly, that Laura Ingalls Wilder was not really a regional writer. She's an American writer. And so I decided to mull that over. But in the fall of 2005, I had second thoughts about writing the book because I knew that the press wanted this biography out fairly soon. And my husband was dying of cancer. When I accepted the offer to write the book, we were still hoping he was in remission. Then we found out that he was dying, and he actually died in November of 2005. So I called the press and told them, you might not want me to write this book because I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about work. I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about anything. And they were very generous. And they said, no, we want you to do this book. And then my late husband, shortly before his death, told me, you need this book. You'll need this book after I'm gone. And he was right. because I began doing the research shortly after he died. It gave me something to do, something that I felt was important to do. And as I began to do research on the book, I began to examine the editorial letters between Wilder and Rose. And I recognized them as editorial letters, letters that an editor and an author share before a book is published, where you discuss everything from how a book begins and how it ends, what scenes to develop, what scenes to cut, what characters to save, what characters to cut, how the whole novel comes together, how it's structured. All of that was in this wonderful, meaty correspondence, although it is somewhat fragmentary. There are dozens of those letters that survive. And I decided I really wanted to focus on her writing life, because that is what had interested me even back in Missouri when I was, reading Little Town on the Prairie for the first time. I wanted to know about Wilder's life as a writer and how her early life shaped her writing life later on. I wanted to see the connection between the reality of her life and the fiction of her life and how she decided to produce that. And that gave me focus. And that gave me a slightly different story to tell than John Miller had told in Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder. So it gave me something new and fresh to say. And then the book was published in 2007.
Did you find that the book was welcomed in the greater Laura Ingalls Wilder world?
I think the book did much better than I thought it would.
Really?
I have to tell you, my literary agent at the time thought it was a mistake to take on this project. And she said it would be a labor of love and that I would never make any money off of it. Well, I haven't made much money off of it.
But that was her reasoning, just the money?
And she wanted me to continue to work in fiction. But she said, if it's something you want to do, go ahead. She really did not think that the book would have any staying power. And I have to say, when I told other people in the Portland community that I was working on a book about Laura Ingalls Wilder, I remember I was at a library event and a prominent librarian in Portland came up to me and said, "Hey, what are you working on?" And she had been on at least 2 and possibly 3 Newbery committees over the years. And I told her I was working on a new biography of Laura Ingalls Wilder. And she said, "Oh, hasn't everything already been said about her?" And then she walked away. So I was kind of surprised and relieved that the book was generally, I think, very well received. I remember being at a South Dakota book festival. I think we were in Deadwood. And at the end of my presentation, a man raised his hand and asked me if I thought being a woman gave me special insights into writing a biography on Laura Ingalls Wilder. And I thought, that's a kind of odd question to ask. And I said, no, I didn't think that made any difference, but I did think that perhaps writing fiction had helped me understand a bit more about the relationship between Rose and Laura Ingalls Wilder. And that seemed to satisfy him. And the copy of Writer's Life that he was holding was dog-eared, and you could see all these Post-it notes in it. And afterwards, I found out, he came up and introduced himself to me. It was John Miller. I hadn't met John before.
Oh, who had written Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder in 1998.
So we became very good friends, and come to find out, he grew up in Missouri too, in the Ozarks, down in Monette, which is about 40, 50 miles south of where I grew up. So we began to correspond regularly. I'll never forget that question, because I thought, wow, this person seems to be very informed, and it's a really interesting question. And then, he was a biographer himself. So anyway, I thought that was a really special moment.
It really was. Can you tell me how you came to edit Pioneer Girl, how that project came to you?
When I was researching a writer's life, I made a field trip to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in West Branch, Iowa, which houses a huge collection of Wilder and Lane papers. And there were only 2 of us who were working in the library that day. It was very quiet. I was sitting in the research room going over materials, and I overheard one of the archivists take a telephone call. And it was from someone who was interested in the Pioneer Girl manuscripts. And I heard the archivist explain how many versions they had at the library, what their policy was. They could Xerox a copy and how much it would cost per page for the various versions. And when he hung up, I said, "Do you get a lot of calls like that?" And he said, "Yeah, we do." And I thought, that's really interesting. Because I used Pioneer Girl as a major reference for Writer's Life. There's so much material in Pioneer Girl. So I kind of tucked that idea away. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I just let the idea simmer. And there were so many different versions. I thought, maybe what we need, because there's not one definitive version of Pioneer Girl, is maybe an annotated version would be appropriate. So I called the South Dakota State Historical Society Press and said, "I've had this idea. What do you think?" And they liked it.
I did not know this came from you. That's wonderful to learn.
It really came from that random call that I overheard in the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. Working on Pioneer Girl was a life-consuming project. The manuscript itself isn't very long. It's a very short manuscript. And when I first pitched the idea to the South Dakota Press, I thought it would take me no time to annotate. I was wrong, obviously. I started work on the project, I think, in 2010, and the book was published 4 years later. But it was an all-consuming project. One sentence, one paragraph might require 4 or 5 annotations because there were so many historical references, literary references, family references. It just turned out to be a much, much, much bigger project than I ever envisioned. I thought about it kind of like, I don't know if you've ever read Middlemarch by George Eliot. There's a character in Middlemarch named Mr. Casaubon, and Mr. or Casaubon, however you want to pronounce it. And anyway, he's at work on the key to all mythologies. And he spends his life researching all of this obscure material and collecting notes and putting things in files, and he never finishes it. And I felt that Pioneer Girl was my key to all mythologies, that I would be working on this forever, that I would never finish it, and that even if I did finish it, no one would read it. So I was completely surprised that so many people found Pioneer Girl to be a meaningful book.
What were some of the best moments in researching and putting together Pioneer Girl and its annotations?
Well, one of the things that I discovered is that with rare exception, I think there were only 2 to 3 people that are mentioned in Pioneer Girl that I was unable to find. Out of all of the characters that she mentions, all the historical characters, that was astounding to me because clearly she had an amazing memory, and we could find almost everyone that she mentioned in the historical record. That was astounding to me and really gratifying. And it increased my respect for her immeasurably. That, a lot of people said, oh, she just wrote little books about her past, but she had a really, not just a really good memory, but she knew how to use those characters and knew how to make them work and convert them from fact to fiction. And working on Pioneer Girl just increased my appreciation for her artistry in that way. And then too, for me, one of the biggest revelations, and it goes back to when I was working on Writer's Life, the first time I read Pioneer Girl, by the way, it was over the holiday break. I was teaching at Washington State University in Vancouver, and the microfilm came up to me. So I spent the whole holiday vacation in the library looking at an old, microfilm and an old microfilm machine, because that was all that was available at the time. On one of the first opening pages of Pioneer Girl, I found out that Pa had traded Jack along with the horses. And so that Jack in the Little House books is an entirely fictional character. And I had to read and reread that line over and over again because I didn't want to believe it, because I really believe in Jack as a real character. But that small discovery, again, increased my appreciation for her mastery as an artist, because she makes a fully realized canine character out of Jack that we all believe in. And that was one of those moments when, I just kind of gasped and realized, my goodness, she was really a gifted writer. And there were other discoveries along the way, many other things that I learned, but by and large, the whole process just increased my respect for her as an artist and as kind of an American literary treasure.
At what point was it apparent to you that Pioneer Girl was going to be as successful as it was?
That's a good question. I had an inkling that something was happening because the summer before Pioneer Girl was published, I was working with Missouri State University to develop what was called a massive open online class about Laura Ingalls Wilder. I was going to teach a literature class on Wilder online for more traditional students, but the massive open online class would be available to anyone online. And I was on campus. We had shot 2 or 3 episodes for the class. We were just getting ready to open the class for enrollment. And we were expecting perhaps at most 200 or 300 students to enroll. Now, keep in mind that the South Dakota State Historical Society Press had been promoting Pioneer Girl since the spring. So there was already some buzz about the book coming out. And I remember I was in a conference room at Missouri State, and one of my colleagues walked in and her face was white. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Well, we've just opened up enrollment and we already have 2,000 students." And I thought, oh, something is happening out here. Something is going on. And then as the summer progressed, it became clear that there was going to be much more demand, not only for my class, but for Pioneer Girl itself. So for some reason, I think the book was timed just right, and so was the class. And ultimately, the class had over 10,000 students.
Oh, my goodness.
Worldwide.
I remember that. I didn't realize it was that.
It was huge.
Wow. And so then the book was released in 2014?
In late 2014, and the book almost immediately went out of print. And it made headlines around the world. I wanted to order extra copies as gifts for family members, and I didn't have enough given my author's copies. So I placed an order with the South Dakota State Historical Society Press, and they were already out of print. And so the books that I had ordered as Christmas presents for my family didn't arrive until Valentine's Day. And I was getting emails and phone calls from people desperate for copies of the books and hoping that I would have them in time for Christmas, and I didn't, because the book almost immediately sold out.
What was it like for you after the book came out, as an author, as a writer, as the editor and annotator?
Well, usually when a book comes out, nothing really happens. As an author, you have this dream that your book will be an immediate bestseller. And for most of us, that never, ever happens. And my world just kind of went crazy when Pioneer Girl was published. I was getting emails and phone calls from producers in Hollywood who wanted to see if the story could be made into a film. There were calls from reporters. The Public Broadcasting NewsHour did a spot on the book. It was featured in the New York Times. It became a New York Times bestseller. Everything just kind of went crazy. And then over the next 4 years, I traveled throughout the Midwest, sometimes to the East Coast. I made a few presentations on the West Coast. I was traveling, making presentations almost right up until COVID hit. So I was traveling extensively. People wanted to talk about the book, and I was really grateful for that. But it's the kind of promotion and publicity that it's very rare for writers. And I'm grateful that I had that. I was also grateful when I kind of got my life back and could start working on other projects again.
And was it at that point that you said, I am fully done with Laura Ingalls Wilder?
Yes. Well, even when I was on the road making presentations, I was like, well, I'll talk about Laura Ingalls Wilder and then I'll go home and do something else, because I felt like Laura Ingalls Wilder's ghost had taken over my life. And I was grateful to her, but I was ready for something else to happen. But Laura Ingalls Wilder is an iconic American author, and she wasn't quite finished with me yet.
It's true. Laura Ingalls Wilder certainly was not finished with Pamela Smith Hill. Thankfully, she'll be back on the podcast at a later date to tell us exactly what happened next. Land of Laura is created and executive produced by me, Sandra Hume. Special thanks to Canadian folk punk band The Dreadnaughts for our theme music, and extra special thanks to all the guests, like Pamela Smith Hill, who give so generously of their time and their knowledge. I hope to see you next time. Make sure you subscribe to Land of Laura on your favorite podcast channel so you can hear about episodes as soon as they drop. If you're in the U.S., happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. And remember, as Pa says, there's plenty more down cellar in a teacup. And as Ma might have said, it takes all kinds of people to make a Little House world.